Good evening, and thank you for joining this John Smith Centre Power Hour event. My name's Kezia Dugdale and I'm the Director of the John Smith Centre at Glasgow University. This is our 5th Power Hour event, and having cast my eye over the registration list, I'm thrilled to see so many people back returning week on week. Let me also extend a warm welcome to those joining us for the first time, and also to those who are listening again on the John Smith Centre website. All of our John Smith Centre Power Hour events will be on the resources section of our website so that you can listen again. We exist to make the positive case for politics and public service, and we do that in 3 ways. We do it through research, advocacy and internships. In our research, we study what people think about their politicians and their public servants, and we've got a few reports coming out shortly in collaboration with IPPR. We also do advocacy events, much like these Power Hours, trying to debate different aspects of politics and public service, showcasing the very best, showing off what happens behind the scenes. And one of the things that we're most proud of is our highly paid, structured internship programmes for young people across the country, getting a real behind the scenes look at what politicians do in practice. We run that at the University of Glasgow, and we also have a Robertson Trust funded scheme that runs across the whole of Scotland. And of course, we announced at the turn of the year there that we are going to have a Future Leaders Academy funded by the Royal Bank of Scotland. So look out for more details of that on our website. The Power Hour series is designed to take a different look at an aspect of power in each session, and we discuss it with a special invited guest who is a real leader in their field. Tonight we're looking at the relationship between polling and politics, and I'm thrilled to have with us Mark Diffley from Mark Diffley Associates, who's one of Scotland's leading pollsters. In the next 60 minutes, we're going to look at how politicians use polling both publicly and privately, and there's plenty of opportunity for you to ask him questions as you go. To do that, just type your question into the Q&A function in the middle of your screen at the bottom of the page. And my colleague Alison Hopper, who's hiding behind this John Smith Centre logo here, will be able to filter those through to our panellists and make sure that we make the best of those opportunities. So please don't be shy at putting your questions forward, and we'll do our very best to build them in. But before we get to the questions, let's get to know Mark. So Mark, welcome. Did you always want to be a pollster?
Oh, certainly not. No.
Right.
But first of all, thank you, Kez. It's lovely to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be taking part in this series. No, I didn't, although my family was relatively political. My dad was quite political, so he was from Ireland, so there was quite a lot of Irish politics in the family, even though we were brought up in London. So yeah, I was always really interested in politics, but I think from the kind of polling point of view, that really didn't strike me until I went to university. So I took a politics and economics degree at Goldsmiths I graduated in the mid-90s, which probably makes me older. Well, not only makes me older, probably graduated before a lot of people on this call were born, I suspect. So that really does age me a fair bit. But during that 3-year degree at Goldsmiths, I was kind of fortunate enough to do a module in statistics, which really kind of set the foundations. I then went on to University of North London and did a master's degree in research methodology, which sounds...
You're the guy that likes the numbers. Everybody else is obsessing over the ideology and the kind of you like the numbers.
I think so, yeah. And certainly what got me, I mean, the research field, which includes polling, and I mean, I do quite a lot of political work, but actually most of my work isn't political. It's not about political polling. It's, broadly social research and market research, either for, public bodies, governments, or, charities, big businesses, small businesses, whatever. But it was the numbers that got me into it. But of course, these days it's about much more than numbers. There's quite a lot of qualitative research goes on as well. And although that didn't quite come as naturally to me in my career, and it wasn't kind of my first choice, I would say that's a big proportion of what I do now. That's in both the political sphere and in the rest of of what I do. No. So I really didn't consider this as a career option until I was probably about 20 or 21. Before that, I wanted to be a footballer, which is very boring, very obvious. I actually I didn't join the police, but I trained as a police cadet in the Met when I was very young. And I actually trained for just under a year as a journalist as well. And
it's quite helpful, I'd imagine, in like
yeah, still do a little bit of shorthand.
The detail.
Yeah.
So we're going to look at a little bit about the types of polling that you do, because you're right, it's not just all about politics when it comes to shaping public policy. Quite often you work with different NGOs and charity groups to influence government policy just as much as you're looking at those actors in government. But before we get into the detail of that, so you come out of uni, you've got this master's in research methodologies. I mean, you don't instantly become a pollster. Who did you go and work for? How did you get to kind of working for somebody else to then setting up your own company? What did you do in your career?
So I graduated and worked for a few years in London, mainly with the organisation that's now called the National Centre for Social Research, which is I suspect quite a well-known body to a lot of people on this call. It's a sort of quasi-academic research organisation and do brilliant, really brilliant stuff. And I kind of cut my teeth there, really. I learned lots about statistics there. I learned lots about research methodology and applying that into kind of real life situations. When I got to the sort of late 90s, I'd been working 2 or 3 years, and I decided that I wanted to leave London, which was, I'd as I said earlier, been brought up and studied in and around London my whole life. So I felt that I wanted to live and experience something different. And I came to Edinburgh in 2000, in fact, in July 2000, so almost 20 years ago to the day, in fact. Scotland felt like, at the time, I mean, it's funny because sort of thinking about doing this tonight gives you the sort of opportunity to step back a little bit and just kind of think about what life was like at that point. Of course, Scotland is a massively politically exciting place now, but it actually was then as well for kind of similar but different reasons. Of course, the devolution referendum had taken place, the Parliament had just been set up. There was a whole new, well, executive as they called themselves then, government as they call themselves now. So that was the kind of, it felt like a very exciting place to be. I knew quite a few people in Scotland. My favourite football team is in Scotland, so I'd travelled up to support them quite a lot. So I did have some connection, but making the decision to move up was kind of quite a big deal, and to relocate, obviously. It felt very, very exciting. There was a whole kind of new political culture, a whole new Scottish government, Scottish executive. Businesses were more businesses were moving up to Scotland. So it really did feel like there was a buzz about the place. I mean, little did I know at the time how things were, or many other people, I suspect, how things were going to develop, particularly politically. And I'm sure we'll come on and talk a bit about it as the evening goes.
You worked for Ipsos Mori then at that point?
I did. So I came up and worked with Ipsos Mori, who already had a small office. I'd had one since the very late 90s. So I joined that team. I was actually only about the 3rd or 4th person there, but slowly they grew as well and continued to do so. So I was there, until I had a little spell in the public sector. I worked with Audit Scotland for a couple of years. I wanted to see what it was like working in the public sector. And then I went back to Ipsos after that. So I was a director in the Ipsos office up to 2017, when I set up my own business, which is what I'm kind of happily doing and trying to build.
Never look back.
No, I never look back. I mean, it's really challenging, I have to say, particularly at the moment. None of us saw this coming, so it is not without its challenges. And I, like many other small businesses across the board, have had to really rethink what we're doing, how we're doing it, how we're going to work, how we keep our people, motivated, happy, and all that kind of stuff. It's really been quite a tough few months sitting in this room.
Yeah.
So day after day. So I'm not asking for the violins out, but it has been really difficult.
I think on that basis, Mark, we're even more grateful to you for your time. So we're going to get into the substantive of how polling and focus groups and things work in a second, but we thought we'd make you like show off your trade for a little bit first. So we asked you to kind of show us some polling, and I think you're going to show us two different slides here, one about the forthcoming US elections, and then that small matter of the Scottish constitutional question, because I think a fair bit's happened on that front in recent weeks. So over to you for a 5 minutes of polls, please.
Yeah, so I thought I would just do, the term death by PowerPoint is one which I heartily endorse, I have to say. So I kept this very brief. I suppose there were sort of three things that I wanted to do, and just to share, and I have sourced where this is coming from. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. There were three things really. One was what's going on in the States. One is what's happening in UK politics, and then we'll bring it closer to home. I mean, obviously the US election is the next. I mean, there are kind of quite big elections. There are some big elections going on in Europe at the moment, not least the Polish presidential election, which is worth having a look out for as a possible bellwether as to how Europe may be moving. But the next one that people will really be, I guess, generally kind of fascinated by is the US election, which is now almost exactly, or just under now, 4 months away. So I suppose my argument would be that the polls are now pretty much worth looking at for the first time. You know, we're close enough now. We've got enough of a feel for what's going on that we can start looking at polls and prediction models and so forth. Now, I suppose from the outset, and I can almost hear the sort of the musing off with people listening, is, you know, well, didn't the polls screw up the previous US election? Well, I mean, the truth is that actually the national polling at the 2016 election was pretty good. And of course, Hillary Clinton did win the national vote, which is what the polls predicted. But because of the Electoral College and how the system works, she didn't win the election. We can talk about that a bit more, if you like. But what's really interesting and what's going on in the States at the moment is that sort of almost unnoticed now, Biden is in a really strong position. So this is the kind of latest poll of polls, if you like. The kind of bringing together of all the polls by an organisation called 538, whose website I would really encourage people to go and have a look at. Not perfect, but really good, and brings a lot of really good information together in one place. They do really good podcasts. They do really kind of interesting articles, very digestible. So if you're interested in the US election, there are, you know, New York Times is really good as well, but 538 is a really good kind of data source.
We've had our first question there, Mark, just on that point. We're being asked, how far out is pre-election polling data actually useful or accurate? So you're saying just turning onto it now, but
yeah, I think so.
The campaigns, will they have been caring about the detail of their internal polls before now?
Oh, they will have done. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we'll come on to talk about, you know, more generally the kind of relationship between polls and politicians. You know, in America particularly, there is a real obsession with polls. There's a huge market for polls. In fact, it's quite a lot bigger than it is, as in there are a lot more polling companies. So it is in America than there are here. I mean, we can, as I said at the beginning, I think about now is about the time to be looking out. We've got the two conventions coming up in the next month or so, which is generally when the public starts to kind of switch on. There's a lot of media coverage of the conventions for the challengers, which of course is the Democrats now. In this election, the vice presidential nominee is put forward. And from there on, you really kind of hit the ground running in terms of events, TV debates, and so on. Obviously, that's going to look slightly different this year, I suspect, with the virus, although no one quite knows how exactly at the minute. I think now, and it's worth looking sort of historically, and although I don't show it on there, just a couple of pointers, I suppose. One is, in recent history, when we look at Trump's approval ratings at the moment, no president has won. So if he has won from an approval rating as low as his, it's not shown. This is voting intention, so it would be on a different visual. The only two presidents who in recent times had approval ratings as poor as his at this stage, so approaching their first their election after pretty much 4 years in office, were George Bush Sr. And Jimmy Carter, both of whom lost and were the two most recent one-term presidents. So if Trump does turn it around, and I'm certainly not saying that he can't or that he won't, it would be unprecedented in modern times.
We had a question ahead of the event, Mark, about if his poll numbers stay consistently this poor, do you think he might drop out before the race begins? And just following on from that, we've had another question come in live there going, if Kanye West makes it to the ballot, whose favour does that play in?
Well, okay, so that's a very good question. I suppose in answer to your first question, I mean, I don't really know is the answer. I mean, it has been, and there is a bit of chat, and I think it's a bit more than chat at the moment about, I mean, obviously there's quite a lot about what can Trump do, and actually, apart from kind of re again appeal to the base, which, I mean, is arguably what he's done for 4 years pretty much anyway, ultimately kind of unsuccessfully. The context in which he goes into this election is really kind of quite damaging for him. The virus, which persists and is probably as bad as it ever has been now. So the notion that they're going to go in to the election with the virus having passed and the economy on its way to recovery is pretty much a non-starter, I would suggest. And also, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement and a lot of the polling which now suggests that the majority of Americans support Black Lives Matter, support the bringing down of some of the Confederate general statues and that kind of stuff. So the context in which he enters this, it's really difficult to see what he can do. He could, for instance, sack Pence. He could choose a different vice presidential candidate. There are things he could do, but what's going to make any difference? Difficult to see at the minute. So there is a bit of chat that he might, out of vanity as much as anything else, choose not to run. I mean, I suppose my gut feeling would be that won't be the case, that he'll carry on. And I think it's very easy. I mean, at this stage of the cycle, 4 years ago, Hillary was 4 or 5 points ahead in the national polls as well. I think what's different this time is that if you look at the, and again, you can Google quite a lot of this, the New York Times polls in swing states, so Michigan, Wisconsin, Florida, Arizona, North Carolina, places like that. He is places where he won by a really tiny margin in 2016, but because of the way the Electoral College worked, he gets all the votes and therefore got over the line. Biden is massively ahead in these places. And in a sense, that's more important because of the way the system works, the Electoral College works. Yeah. That's more important than looking at the national polls. Trump could be 3, 4, maybe even 5 points behind in the national polls and still win. At 10 points, like it's shown on there at the minute.
Too much.
Tough.
I'm going to move you on to the independence question in a second, but you sneakily dodged the point about Kanye West.
Kanye West. I'm not really sure he's a massively serious candidate. I mean, it's still unclear about whether he can register at this stage, whether he's still actually going to get his name on the ballot. I mean, it's really interesting. I suppose the obvious 2 points to make, or at one hand, you kind of think, well, this is an ethnic minority candidate. The Democrats, I mean, the Democrats poll 70, 80, 90% amongst different ethnic groups. So one's first thought might be, well, okay, an ethnic minority candidate might damage might damage the Democrats. But Kanye West, as many people on this call will know, has been very pro-Trump and very Trump-friendly. So, those two factors kind of almost play against each other. I don't think it's particularly, and it's just my view, but a particularly serious candidate. So I don't see it really.
Let's leave it there then and fly over to Scotland, and you've got another slide there for us.
Yeah. So the first thing was America. The second thing, I don't have a slide for this, but was on just to sort of to touch very quickly, because I'm sure we might come back to it on UK politics, which is that we're 4.5 years out, obviously, from an election. So voting intention polls, while interesting, particularly for people like me, are probably not worth sweating over too much at the minute. A couple of things worth noting, because one is that Labour has closed the gap on the Tories. So I think on average now, Labour are kind of 3 or 4 points behind in the national polls. But the one thing, of course, that has changed politically since, or party politically, since the election at the end of last year, which God feels like about 3 years ago now, doesn't it? Is Keir Starmer. So, of course, Keir Starmer is now the leader of the Labour Party. He has made a really good first impression with the public, with voters. There was actually a poll out last week from Opinion, I think, which is worth a look at, which was the first poll to show that in a head-to-head, more voters preferred Starmer to Johnson as Prime Minister. Pretty much not worth the paper it's written on at the minute in terms of how things might change, but really worth keeping an eye on that. I think kind of competence is a really important quality that people are looking for at the minute, particularly in times of a national crisis. And I think some of the polling on competence of Starmer versus Johnson at the minute is really interesting to keep an eye on. Obviously, in 4 years' time, the context is likely to be quite different, but often opinions can be formed in the public quite early on. So that's worth really thinking about. Just on, a lot of people will have seen this slide, I tweet it kind of endlessly, but this is how I could have been sitting here any time in the last, it feels almost 20 years actually, and saying, well, this really fascinating time in Scottish politics at the moment. But of course, we really are at the moment, without a doubt. So this is a kind of snapshot of all polls taken on support for independence since the EU referendum, just over 4 years ago now. There have been 71. I haven't updated it with the one from the weekend, so 72 polls now. And what's really interesting, and what you can see from here, is that we are starting to see the mood of the nation, the mood of the country change. I mean, what's quite interesting is if you bookend this graph, you can see, and I remember this polling really well, immediately after, I mean, literally the weekend after the EU referendum, there were 2 or 3 polls that suggested that support for independence had gone up, and it had, but that didn't last. I think that was a kind of an almost immediate reaction to what had happened in the Brexit vote. But we are now starting to see a pattern emerging from enough polls now to sort of suggest this isn't just a blip, but something a little bit more significant, both in terms of the number of polls, in terms of the level of support, and in terms of the length of time. So this has been noticeable now for a good kind of 9 months or so. Now, that's driven primarily by Brexit, so by people in Scotland who voted no in 2014, so voted to stay in the UK, but who voted also to stay in the EU, who now...
Explain how you know that, because like you and I would regularly talk about that and examine how interesting that is. But is that because tracker polls tell us that, and they tell us exactly who's taking part in the polls, so we know that it's no voters who remain that have moved? Can you explain that process a wee bit?
Yeah, so most polls are done online now. The vast majority of polls are done online. So we can get into this a bit more, but they're panels. So people answer even when either when they register to be on like the YouGov's panel or Surveillance panel, or whatever, they will say, this is how I voted at certain events, or in some cases you will ask them in a poll, how did you vote? So you basically know quite a bit about people's voting history, as well as, you know, things like how old they are, which part of the country they come from, what their family composite or their household composition is, all that kind of stuff, whether they work or whether they're a student or retired or whatever their kind of employment status. So yeah, we know all that. So we can, in the background with this data, we can start to kind of play around with it. And we can isolate people who say, well, I voted no in 2014 and now I would vote yes. Well, what are the characteristics of those people? You can kind of isolate them and say, well, what are the things that they have in common? One of the things that they have in common is that they voted to remain in the EU. They have other things in common as well. They tend to be a bit younger. They tend to be more middle class. But the thing that they really share is that they voted they're anti-Brexit, so they voted to stay in the EU. And what they're now basically telling the likes of me is that, you know, if there was a choice between being in an independent Scotland that was in the EU, that would be preferable from being part of the UK but outside of the EU. And that is enough. There are enough of them to account for that support for independence coming up. I mean, I should say there are people moving in the other direction as well. This is a kind of fluid, you know, this is a kind of fluid situation. There are people, for instance, who voted yes in 2014, but who voted for Brexit, and would rather now be in the UK outside of Brexit than an independent Scotland within the EU. But the first group is bigger than the second group, and that's what gives you kind of net effect.
So that's fascinating, and it's really interesting to see you present the polls since the EU referendum's taken place. If I can maybe just take you back a wee bit further to the polls in the final days of the referendum leading up to 2014. My nationalist friends reflect on that experience and say that the poll that came out 10 days prior to the referendum, which was the first poll which put yes ahead of the Better Together campaign, was, on reflection, the worst possible thing that could have happened. It spurred an energy in the other side's campaign, which in a way took them over the line, because it led to things like the Vow and the Daily Record and Gordon Brown's intervention and all of that kind of past history. So that leads me to sort of like take a handbrake turn into a question that we've had from Keith MacDonald here, who says, and it's more of a philosophical question, who really gains from the ability to predict the outcome of democratic events like elections? Is there not an underlying danger there that having so much information might undermine the sort of democratic process? Does it not make the democratic process almost more fragile because it's more exposed?
Well, I mean, I would argue not, but you know, you would say that would be.
It's your job, yeah.
I mean, I think kind of information is power, to use a kind of trite expression. You know, before, I mean, opinion polling has been around since George Gallup in the sort of 1940s. Of course, it is an industry that is there to provide information, data, insight for both voters and for governments. I mean, I think maybe what the questioner is getting at, which I do have sort of some sympathy with, but which isn't particularly kind of backed up by any of the kind of academic studies, is that, you know, if something's a foregone conclusion, if all the data suggests that something is going to happen, then, you know, kind of what's the point in kind of taking part? But they are there for kind of information purposes. They are absolutely transparent. So any one of those polls, any one of those 71, 72 polls that are on there, you can go online, you can see exactly when it was done, how it was done, by whom, for whom, what the sample size was, how it was weighted. You know, I could continue. Obviously, I could, as I'm sure people here could, think of ways and examples of how polls are quite often sort of misreported. and um, and kind of abused, I suppose.
Yeah.
But the information is all there about how polls are done. I mean, quite an interesting.
The polling code as well. It's regulated, isn't it?
It is regulated. I mean, it's self-regulated, but nonetheless, it's not in a. I mean, this is the thing. It's not in a pollster's interest to get anything wrong, and it's certainly not in a pollster's interest to give advice or information to a client, whether that's a politician or anyone else.
Yeah.
Which is misleading. I mean, that would be kind of commercial suicide, really, in a way. I mean, interesting. There's a really good example of. This may seem a bit niche, but I'll go with it anyway. The Oldham by-election, the Oldham West by-election of 2015, which is the last example, at least that I can think of a by-election that had no opinion polls done at all during the whole campaign. There wasn't a single poll done. And if you look at, it was done after the 2015 general elections. I think it was like the November or December of 2015. The opinion pollsters, myself included, had taken a big picking after the 2015 election, and quite rightly so. There had been, and there was a big inquiry about that afterwards. There had been some quite significant kind of failures in polling during that election. I think that was one of the reasons why no one commissioned any polling for the Oldham West by-election. But what's really quite funny is that if you go and look at the coverage of that, and look at things like the betting odds the day before, UKIP were favourites to win. There's loads of evidence that Nigel Farage had taken all this resource and pumped it in. He'd been on telly saying we're going to win, it's too close to call, blah, 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 blah. Labour won by 20,000 votes or something. It was an absolute landslide. And the absence, I mean, yeah, okay, political polls don't always get everything completely spot on. But I think if you take a step back, you understand what they are and the purpose that they serve. It's not a science. It's not saying this is exactly what is going to happen at some point in the future. I would never sit here and say if an independence referendum was going to be held tomorrow, the result would be whatever the latest opinion poll had said. Of course it wouldn't. Or I would hope it would be quite close and within a reasonable margin of error. But sometimes how these things can be observed by what happens in their absence. And Oldham West is a really good example. It's pretty niche, as I say.
Is it the biggest political polling upset that you've witnessed? That's a question that's coming from Adam Lang. Or can you think of a bigger whopper than Oldham West?
Oh, Oldham West. Well, Oldham West, of course, happened in the absence of polling. I think polling, the polls leading up to 2014 were fascinating. I mean, I was sort of a little bit of insight. I was doing lots of private polling at that point for the UK government, and I was they were my client, and so I was probably the least surprised person in the world to see that YouGov poll hit the streets on. It was the Sunday, sort of week and a half before the referendum, because the private polling had pretty much shown that as well. So I didn't find that particularly surprising. The surprising stuff, the biggest surprise, I guess, in some ways, was the 2011 Scottish parliamentary elections, which the SNP won by a landslide. And I mean, just very briefly, I suppose, what's interesting about that is, although it is within our, well, depending on whether you're a student on this call or not, you know, we can all pretty much remember that election. I remember it very, very clearly. But what's really interesting is that I remember polling the sort of November or so before, November or December before that election, only kind of 6-7 months out. Labour was miles ahead. And I
remember it.
I remember getting some data. What we also have to remember then is there wasn't as much polling as there is now. Yeah. Actually, what happened in that campaign is that we went from kind of November, December of 2010 through to about kind of February or March 2011. where we weren't measuring anything. There weren't any polls, but obviously out there, things were changing. And without going into what all that was, I remember getting a polling data on my desk in, I think it was the March of 2011, and it showed the SNP and Labour neck and neck. I thought it was wrong. I absolutely thought it was wrong. And, internally was arguing, or, there was an argument about whether something systematically had gone wrong with the poll, whether we should publish, blah, 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 blah. And we did. And of course, it was the first sign that actually things had been changing. And from there, a month or so later, when the campaign had started, the next poll that we did showed the SNP miles ahead, which is what turned out to be the result. So I wasn't surprised at the end, by the time the election took place, over quite a short period of time. I mean, it is a real good case study in how political attitudes, or voting attitudes at least, can change over quite a short period of time.
So let's move on a wee bit. So maybe stop sharing your screen there, Mark, so we can see the fuller version of your face. That's fabulous. And talk a little bit about private polling. So this is something that I think is well known to kind of political insiders, but might not be that well known to the general public more widely, which is the amount of polling that goes on that's never actually published. So it's published for the benefit of political parties, or it's published by particular, it's commissioned, by particular business interests or charities, just to test the public mood. And I'm conscious that, as a former party leader in a past life, of having a limited budget to do a little bit of polling, private polling, about what people thought of me. And it's a very odd exercise for a politician to go through, but I remember it quite vividly. And I'll just share that with you for a second, and then you can tell us some of your own experiences of when people commission it. But the private polling on me said that people thought I was nice, they thought that I was authentic, but they thought I was much more like a nursery teacher than I was a first minister. So that's what we received internally, and of course you would never publish that. There's no benefit to publishing that, but to be able to see yourself as others see you helps shape a political message. So talk to us a little bit about who commissions private polling, and give us more examples of how it's used to influence policy, or indeed in my case, the standing of particular individuals in our public life.
How did it make you feel when you saw that polling?
Well, I wasn't massively surprised, to be honest. In a way, I was pleased, because at the time we'd had a big focus on education. So for the public to have picked up an affinity with something to do with children and young people showed that there was something there cutting through. And, being a fairly optimistic person, I thought, well, I'd much rather have that set of outcomes than some of the other possibilities that could have come from that.
It's interesting, because I've had to... I didn't do that polling, as you know. I have had to go to kind of very senior government or party meetings and deliver some quite awkward messages.
Tell us, Mark, come on, for one night.
And it's quite tough. Again, I don't want the violins out, but it is quite tough.
Yeah.
It is quite tough to deliver something like that to a party leader. So on the political side, private polling could be on the, it could be often around kind of campaigns or elections, when there is a real need to get lots of data quite quickly over a period of time, make some quick decisions about campaigns. I mean, the obvious one for me in my career, which I've sort of alluded to a little bit, was 2013, 2014 and the independence referendum. So we were commissioned, I was with Ipsos at the time, we were commissioned, sort of the public domain, to do a series of private polls which included surveys, so polls as we kind of know them with numbers attached, and a series of focus groups. I say a series, there were a lot of them. I spent a good part of late 2013 and most of 2014 on trains around Scotland. Brilliant, had the time of my life. But basically, from the islands to the east, west, south, whatever, focus grouping, basically how the UK government was messaging its campaign. And that kind of, we were trying to blend what we were finding from the polls with the messages that we were finding from the focus groups. I would go and brief ministers, from secretaries of state through to their advisors and civil servants and so forth. And although I was party to a lot of kind of decision making, and in the room when a lot of decision making was made, that's really not my role. Never did I pretend that it was, or attempt to leave the impression that it was. And I think it's really important to have that distinction, what I'm there for and what I'm not there for. Parties will, on the political side, parties will commission polls sometimes on an ongoing basis. More than likely, maybe it's a new leader, or they want a new policy tested, or, you know, I have worked for, I mean, I've actually worked for most of the political parties on one level or another. I did a series, I mean, before your time as leader, I worked with Scottish Labour. I had to deliver some pretty uncomfortable messages to the party. This was before the independence referendum about how the party was perceived. So this is not just about how you're going to vote, because they can get that from any public poll that's going on, but it's some of the softer stuff.
Yeah.
And not just about the leader, but how the party is perceived, and what the future of the party might be. I mean, really interestingly, I would really suggest to people reading the Labour Together report, which came out last week, was it, or the week before, which was dissecting the reasons why Labour lost the election last week. It's a brilliant read. It's quite a long read, but it's a brilliant read. And one of the really fascinating things that I saw in there was that the people who used to vote Labour, so I'm getting into sort of findings now, but people who used to vote Labour are now the least likely to say that they would vote Labour again. So they become the most severe critics of the party. And I remember reporting that finding back to the Labour leadership team, you know, the best part of 10 years ago now in Scotland. So some of this stuff you find out through polling, some of the stuff you just don't get in the public domain. So
Yeah, I believe it.
There's a real kind of benefit from that. And all parties do it. I think it's absolutely legitimate. I think if you pay for something, if you're a political party or you're a business or a third sector organisation, a charity or so forth, I think you're absolutely entitled to.
So I'm going to ask you very specifically about third sector organisations in a second, and we've got 3 great examples to talk about and 15 minutes left. So I'm just going to ask, no, it's not you, it's me. It's just so much to cover in this time. But just before we leave politics, we've had one more question online from Neil Monroe saying, you know, to what degree do you think COVID will affect independence polling? And I guess there's a wider point there, which is how much are governments polling how they're perceived to be handling the pandemic, and I mean separate from favourability ratings, because newspapers are commissioning those. Are they doing their own internal polls on how well they're being perceived, do you think?
Yeah, they absolutely will be. I think it's going to be hugely important. Here are, very briefly, in sort of 30 seconds, here I think are the steps. If you're in the SNP or a supporter of independence, here are the steps. What you see from the most recent polling is the First Minister's approval ratings are now kind of through the roof, right? So I think from the poll that was out the weekend, more Tories think she's doing a good job. More Tory voters in Scotland approve of the First Minister's job than of the Prime Minister's job in terms of handling the coronavirus, which is, when you think about it, pretty significant, right? So the reason why that's important at the first stage is that we're now only kind of 8 or 9 months until we go into campaigning for another, for the next Holyrood election. The polling for Holyrood 2021 at the moment currently shows that, okay, it is quite rough and ready, putting polling numbers this far out into seat predictors, which are kind of rough and ready at the best of time. But anyway, what they suggest is that the SNP will win, not just win again, but probably win an overall majority again. Of course, events can change and blah, 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 right? So the next parliament at this stage looks like it might resemble the 2011 to 16 parliament more than it resembles the current parliament, right? So why is that important? It's important for 2 reasons. One, because there will be a built-in pro-independence majority in Holyrood, and it just enhances the mandate. It becomes, you know, you've got a 5-year horizon now on the next parliament. It's going to become increasingly difficult for the UK government to keep saying no to a second independence referendum. So you can see how those building blocks, one by one, are kind of getting put in place, and you can see how polling is enabling these decisions and this kind of thought process to be made. Without this evidence from polling, we wouldn't really know where we were. And so this is why
the power of polling.
This is really why it is so powerful. And, you know, it really amply, I think, or hopefully for people on the call, kind of illustrates what you know, how powerful it can be, even this far out.
So let's move slightly away from politics, although we're still sort of in the kind of thread of policy making and how you influence change, and look at maybe how some other organisations use polling. So in advance of the event, people always have an opportunity to submit questions before we start. And we had one from Jamie Kinloughlin from Who Cares Scotland, asking specifically how charities can use polling to advance their sort of campaign priorities. And I was just looking through your recent tweets, and I found a really good example of Citizens Advice Scotland, I think, commissioning a poll with you to look at how family finances were affected by coronavirus, and then that allowed them to produce a news story about how the government needed to respond. Can you talk us through that process? So a charity comes to you and says, we've got this campaign priority to do X, can you help us? What do you do?
It's a really good question, and I was keen on this as well, although we have concentrated on politics, to sort of stress I did at the beginning that it's not the majority of my time, it's what people think I do, but I actually don't. Yeah, the third sector, I think, is increasingly aware of and alive to the opportunities and the power that that polling or research more broadly can make. So we've worked with, my organisation has worked with we've worked with Shelter, we've worked with MND Scotland, a charity I know you know very well, Sue Ryder, Amnesty International, League Against Cruel Sports, Enable. So charities that cover a kind of wide range of issues, if you like. Now, some of those are kind of campaigning charities. So, you know, League Against Cruel Sports, which is a charity but asks very, you know, it's very obvious why they would want to use polling, particularly given what they, I suspect, anticipate what the answers might be, given we are all kind of, the vast majority of us are very anti, not just fox hunting, but other kind of countryside pursuits or sports as well. But charities can use polling in lots of different ways. So it might be, if it's a kind of big kind of national charity like Shelter, we will use, we've polled for them about, well, have you seen this campaign? Where did you see it? How powerful was it? Did it, you know, how did it make you feel differently about this issue, about social housing or other things? I mean, I don't want to say too much about stuff we've done with individual charities, but with kind of some of the big human rights charities, we've looked at what their operation is like in Scotland, whether people, particularly for a national or international charity, you might want to talk to the public about, well, should we have the same priorities that we have in other parts of the UK or other parts of the world? Or to what extent should we have a kind of really Scottish focus? What do people expect from us? How likely are people to support a charity in Scotland if it's seen as a kind of a big international charity rather than having a Scottish focus? So all these things kind of play in. Often with charities, people will say to me, well, how can we expand our reach? How can we reach more people? You know, all these people that are out there, how can we get to more people? How can we, because, you know, sometimes these conversations are quite uncomfortable, but the charity sector is quite kind of competitive. I know that's a kind of horrible word, but, you know, eyes on your campaign is you know, it's quite a difficult thing to do.
From a media perspective, certainly, they're all competing for the same space.
Yeah, so sometimes it feels a bit uncomfortable to talk about these things, but it is really important. My starting point, as it is with other things that I do, is often to say, well, how do you use the data that you have at the moment? how do you kind of sweat, if you like, in our terms, sweat the data that you have? How do you, often charities will have kind of big databases of individuals who have engaged with that charity one way or another. It might just be signing a petition, it might be donating to them, it might be giving up some time to do something for them. How have you engaged with them thoroughly, other than, you know, sending them e-newsletters or whatever? And often in my experience, that hasn't often been the case. So there's actually quite a lot more you can do with your existing data and with your existing kind of database of, you know, loosely what might be termed supporters or people who have engaged with you on one level or another. I mean, I'm not in the business of sort of turning away new research work, but often that can be, you know, and I think sort of broaden this out a bit, not just for charities, you know, there is a real future for people like me and my organisation in helping people make more of the data that they already have, rather than just going, oh, we need to find out something new, let's just do a new poll. Often, at least some of the answers can lie in what you already have. And if they don't, then go out and collect the data by all means. But even if your existing data doesn't exactly answer the question that you have burning in your head that you want an answer to, often it can go some way to answering it and provide you some evidence. And certainly it can inform any new polling or any new research that you want to do. So I'm really keen, and I say this to lots of people actually, what data do you have already? How can we help you to actually make the more of that, analyse it in different ways, pull it all together, rather than just saying, okay, right, let's just go and collect this new data. That's not really always the most efficient way of going about things.
So I think that's super helpful to understand how polling's used as a snapshot of a moment in time, like where people are and what they think. So, you know, that the citizens' advice work, which you've been tweeting about, I think the figure there is 58% of Scots are concerned about their family finances because of COVID-19. And suddenly that's the story. But there's another type as well, isn't there? Because that's just very much a statement of fact about the current state of play. There's other ways to use the research that you're doing to try and drive public opinion or to change attitudes and moods. And I'm just really conscious that you've also been talking about some work that you're doing with Nesta, and I'm conscious that Adam Lang is on this call from Nesta, but you've been doing a specific bit of research about AI, international intelligence, and the degree to which people fear technology. I mean, surely that's about understanding the data behind that, so that people in the future are less scared of technology because it's going to be such a key part of our future.
Yeah.
So how is data in that context used to change or nudge people's attitudes and behaviours?
Well, I think it's, and I'm not just saying this because Adam is on the call, but it's one of the bits of work that I'm most kind of keen to promote and most kind of proud of in many ways, because, and particularly as we carry on through this crisis, I mean, the relevance of this work almost grows by the day, because you know, you can't turn on a TV or a debate, a political debate now about, you know, we're going to be left with all these, you know, so many more hundreds of thousands, millions of people unemployed. How are we going to retrain them and do the kind of jobs of the future? And essentially, although at the time when Adam and I were doing this work, we didn't see this virus coming, it feels massively relevant now. And it's the first study done in Scotland really that attempts to sort of say, well, what do people know about these new technologies? What do they understand by them? How can they be used in kind of everyday life? And what are the sort of barriers to people wanting to use them? So we did some polling in a sort of traditional sense, but we also did a series of workshops around the country where we not only talked to people, there was small groups of people in much more detail about these attitudes, but invited guest speakers to come in and share much more information about how these technologies work. And then we measured how people's attitudes changed as they find out a bit more about how these things work, and they do. And they, you know, the report I think is coming out in the next few weeks. So I would encourage people to look out for it. But getting to your point, this could be really kind of instrumental, I think. This is, breaking down these barriers, trying to encourage people. There is clearly, what this research will highlight is there is a lack of trust, there is a lack of confidence, there is a lack of people's kind of innate or self-perceived innate abilities to be able to use this stuff, and a real lack of knowledge about, well, how do I use it? How is this ever going to help me? And my argument would be that if I'm in government, I really need to tap into this. I really need to be able to understand this before I can then make some decisions about how we're going to invest in this and how we're going to bring people along. Because in 10, 15, 20 years, we're all going to have to be doing this stuff in our everyday lives. And we're starting at a fairly low base in terms of what we feel about this technology and our confidence in being able to use it. And there is a lot of mistrust out there. Yeah. Big data companies and about, Big Brother and all this kind of stuff. And we'll, when the report comes out, that will be evidence. But it's a good piece of research. It's really evidence-based. And I think and hope that it will have an impact on how government feels about this stuff.
So just for everybody's benefit, Nesta, and put me on the spot here, is you'll be able to find them on Twitter, and it stands for the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts. So they have a base in Scotland, and they're also UK wide. So they'll be publishing this report in the next few weeks for people to have a read of. It sounds absolutely fascinating, Mark, and as you say, hugely important. We've just got time for 2 more questions before we leave you, because by the nature of it being called a power hour, we literally cannot go over the 60-minute mark. I'm sure you appreciate it. One just very simple question from Lynn Armstrong. She said, how do people get involved in polling? Do you register, or are you just picked out of the hat? Can people self-select? And if they wanted to do that after tonight's call, where would you recommend they go?
Well, you shouldn't self-select. I mean, you can go on to, the big online panels are YouGov, Survation. There's Scott Pulse in Scotland, which is the STV owned. That is a political polling, but that's other types of kind of market research and so on. There's in Scotland, there's like Panel Base. So they're the kind of main ones. I mean, just Google them and you can go on. I'm afraid one of the days where you used to get paid for doing surveys, I'm afraid.
I think it took me 7 years to get my 50 quid from you guys. Yeah. But I think I started it in like 2001.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And actually, that's not just from a kind of financial point of view, but it's probably not good to incentivize people to take part in too many surveys. There are lots of kind of reasons for that, which I won't bore you with.
You started this session with a real enthusiasm for politics and the political process. So our final question really comes from Chris Cregan, who says, how do you keep so excited about the machinations of politics when it's become so increasingly toxic? What good do you see?
Hi, Chris. Well, I do. I retain an enthusiasm. Where does it come from? I don't know. I've got young children, so I try and impart. I mean, they're sort of coming up to teenagers and stuff now, but so in fact my son is a teenager now, so he's getting quite interested in this. So a lot of it, I guess, he started to show interest in it, not in polling, thankfully, but generally in kind of what's going on and kind of how the world works and politics and so on and so forth. So I find that's quite a useful way of keeping my enthusiasm going. I just find it. I guess I find it endlessly fascinating. When I look for people to work with, whether it's staff or clients or whatever, I think being curious and being always wanting to know why this, why that, are things I really look for. The clients I like most are the ones that will engage with you in conversations, not just collect the data and go away again. The ones that really want the dialogue. And the people I like working with the most, either staff, colleagues, and whatever, are people who are interested and are curious about what's going on. And to sort of butcher that quote about London, if you're bored of politics in Scotland, you're bored of whatever, fill in the rest of that. I mean, it is toxic. I have had to, I don't get half as much as you or or other people. I've had a bit, but not a lot. So I'm fortunate not to be on the receiving end of too much toxicity.
It's worth it, Mark. It's worth it for the whole thing. Can I just
find
tell you,
it entirely distasteful.
absolutely fascinating 60 minutes talking to you about polling, all the rest of it. I've learned a huge amount, and I know that everybody who's tuned in will feel the same way. So thank you so much.
You're more than welcome.
In true polling style, the minute that we hit leave on this meeting, a poll or a bit of research is going to come up on the screen so that people can leave their instant feedback about how they enjoyed the event. And also there's an opportunity there for people to put forward ideas for future speakers or future themes that they would like to hear from. So please take a moment to fill in that evaluation just as you log off from tonight. You will also be sent the same survey by email tomorrow, so you cannot escape it, and it does really shape our work. The next Power Hour event is on the 27th of July at 1 p.m. and it's going to be with Preet Kaur-Gill, who is Britain's first female Sikh MP, and she's also the Shadow Secretary of State for International Development. So we're going to be looking at lots of different issues there with her on the 27th of July. So get that in your diary. You can register for that now. But for tonight, that's it. Thanks very much and good night. Bye.